Welcome back. Now we're going to spend a little time talking about issues around masculinity and how masculinity intersects with other identities. So, why are we talking about masculinity? Just as with whiteness, understanding the idea of masculinity is crucial to our understanding of how gender functions in the United States. Usually when we speak of gender, we speak only of marginalized genders and only get part of the picture. We need to examine masculinity because hegemonic masculinity normalizes masculinity and makes it invisible. Masculinity becomes the default, the normal way of being, and labels everything else as deviant. So, when we talk about masculinity, one of the first things that comes up is male privilege. And yes, male privilege is real. However, it's also intersectional. Not all masculine people have the same type of privilege, and how much privilege you have depends a lot on your other identities. Hegemonic masculinity is white, rich, heterosexual, and able-bodied. If you differ from hegemonic masculinity in any way, there is a lessening of the privileges afforded to you. What's more, because hegemonic masculinity is normalized and considered the default, any loss of privilege is taken as a form of emasculation. Overall, there are three ways marginalized men and other masculine people manage this sense of emasculation. They either become hypermasculine and overemphasize hegemonic masculine traits. They find a way to reformulate masculinity by holding up some hegemonic masculine traits as more important than others, or by drawing from a different cultural standard of masculinity, or they reject hegemonic masculine ideas altogether. Men and masculine people who are physically or developmentally disabled often end up being infantilized and thought of as not fully men. Hegemonic masculinity is very linked to physicality, aggressiveness, mental toughness, and virile sexuality. So men and masculine people who are unable to meet those standards of masculinity are considered weak. There's also a link between disability and lower income, so men with disability are often not wealthy as well. How men and masculine people compensate for this shows up in a number of ways. They might try to be hypermasculine, playing competitive sports or being aggressively sexual. They might look for other models of masculinity that do not emphasize physical and mental toughness. Or they might actively reject the trappings of masculinity and push back against being required to fit a certain mold of manhood. Gay men's masculinity is often called into question. By not seeking sexual relations with women, they are often seen as the opposite of real men. Submissive, effeminate, sensitive, and frequently found in professions otherwise dominated by women. Gay men tend to react to this by embracing hypermasculinity, having incredibly muscular bodies, or taking on tough personas such as those popular in the leather and bear communities, or rejecting masculine norms and emphasizing their femininity. This can be seen in the drag community or in the rise of male social media beauty influencers. Working class men are usually seen as physically strong, but not particularly clever or intelligent, and unlikely to be successful in anything that doesn't involve physical labor. Working class men often compensate for this by embracing the hypermasculine stereotype of crudeness, being vociferously against anyone who does not meet the physical standards of hegemonic masculinity, and by rejecting authority figures. Like feminine people from non-European ethnicities, masculine people from non-European ethnicities struggle with the differences between how their culture views origin views of masculinity, their culture of origin views masculinity, and the ideals of masculinity held by American culture, as well as the historical differences between cultures. Masculine people from non-European ethnicities are often thought of as physically smaller and weaker, more likely to be quiet and meek, and considered less attractive by American culture. Masculine people of non-European ethnicity usually deal with this by embracing the physical aspects of American hegemonic masculinity, as seen in the rise of non-European men working at becoming physically larger and stronger through strength training. Alternately, looking at their origin culture's ideals of masculinity and instead emulating those aspects, or rejecting both American and their origin culture's ideals of masculinity, and finding other ways to express their own ideas of what is masculine. Masculine people of non-white races are often stereotyped as either subservient and socially weak, or violent and overtly sexual. There is also a real experience of being powerless in situations in a way that is outside their control. That feeling of powerlessness causes many more non-white men to embrace the hyper-masculine image of black and brown men, being very physically strong and tough, very sexually virile, and willing to do violence at any point. While this is a fairly common strategy to compensate for the emasculation of powerlessness, it's not the only strategy employed. There are many who reject the hypermasculine stereotypes, and instead find alternate models of masculinity based on religious life or family life. Still others look to origin cultures for different masculine ideals. Before we end, I'd like to talk about the concept of toxic masculinity. It's a topic that pops up a lot in certain realms of social media, and can prompt a lot of anger and defensiveness. Toxic masculinity are the aspects of hegemonic masculinity that damage masculine people's mental health, physical health, and the ability to form and maintain relationships. It creates narrow limitations on what behavior is considered appropriately masculine, and invites ridicule for those who do not fit those standards. So, what are the hallmarks of toxic masculinity? Stoicism, for one. The feeling that masculine people must take on problems on their own without help, and that a man must always be tough. The thought that men are inherently more violent, and that violent outbursts should be excused. The thought also that men are unable to control their sexual appetites. The idea that women are conquests, trophies to be won for status. That men must be the providers for their families. And why are these a problem? All of these combined lead to a situation where masculine people have only two acceptable means for expressing emotion: rage and sexual pleasure. This can lead to violent behavior from men that is not good for either the men or for society. Because there are so few options for emotional expression, masculine people are more likely to experience emotional stress, abuse substances, hurt those around them, experience physical symptoms caused by stress, such as heart disease, and commit suicide at higher rates. The ideals of masculinity that encourage toxic behavior are bad for men and bad for society. So, what then is healthy masculinity? Masculinity can still be strong and tough, but it also needs to allow men to be honest about their needs, their feelings, and desires, and to do so without fear of retribution. Healthy masculine people can express a full range of emotion and seek help when it's needed. Healthy masculine people value the feminine as another type of strength, rather than something weak or threatening. And by its same token, value feminine people, not as potential sexual partners. Think John Legend, not John Wick. Terry Crews, not Aaron Hernandez. Trevor Noah, not Tosh 2.0. LeBron James, not Kobe Bryant. Will Smith, not Mel Gibson. There's a lot of good news on this front. Feminism expanded the roles of women, and is beginning to have a similar effect on the roles of men. As more and more young men grow up in a world where gender isn't a barrier for women, they're also creating more spaces to explore gender for everyone. The result is that we're seeing more young men willing to talk about their feelings, who don't feel being labeled effeminate for having gay friends, who are willing to seek support from friends, family, and professionals when it's needed. Next, we're going to watch a video on one man's experience exploring masculinity and what he discovered. It's a bit long, but it's really worthwhile, so stick with it. Then we'll explore what exists outside the binary of man and woman.